Good morning again and welcome to Coffee with Mr. V. Today we're just going to follow on from what we did in our last lesson, which was about tariffs, and go on to doing domestic subsidies as a form of protectionism. I've done subsidies before, but we're doing it this time as a form of protectionism rather than just as a vehicle to increase the production of a particular good because it was a merit good, or to kind of increase output for some other domestic reason. This is protectionism. We're doing it to reduce imports. So you know the score by now. Go and grab yourself a coffee or whatever your favorite liquid is. Go and put it in a mug, a cup, a glass, whatever it might be. And then with me, we will do the synchronized sip. Okay, and that's going to be the part of your day. So here goes. 1, 2, 3. I do love coffee, especially when in a Tottenham Hotspur mug. So domestic subsidies as a form of protectionism then. So whenever you're doing these protectionist diagrams, okay, you need to start off with the same diagram in that you have your demand and supply, and this, remember, is your domestic supply. So I think in my previous lesson on tariffs, we were talking about the UK trouser market as an example. We can continue with this for now. And then we talked about the world supply curve being a perfectly horizontal line here because it had perfectly elastic supply. Just as a reminder then, we said it had perfectly elastic supply because the world is a large place compared to the UK, or whatever internal market this might be. The world is a much bigger place, and therefore the world could supply effectively an infinite amount of this good compared to the domestic demand. So it's not literally infinite, but it's as good as infinite. We can certainly satisfy all the demand in this domestic market and some. So the analysis for this diagram remains the same as the tariff diagram. This is how much people would demand at the world price. But this is all that can be supplied by domestic producers. Again, the reason why is because think of this as a marginal cost curve. In fact, it is a marginal cost curve, and therefore the price only allows these consumers here to be competitive. Any producers up here whose marginal costs above the price wouldn't be competitive. They wouldn't be able to produce and then sell because there wouldn't be any profit for them. Fine. So a tariff then we would impose on the foreign producers, and we would shift the world supply curve upwards. A domestic subsidy then, or rather a subsidy on domestic producers, we're now looking to affect the domestic supply curve, okay, because we're giving them the subsidy. We're not giving subsidies to foreign producers. That wouldn't make any sense. So we give the subsidy to domestic producers. And if you remember from kind of year one microeconomics, what we do when we do that is we shift the supply curve to the right. This is because costs of production are coming down. All right, and whenever cost of production coming down, you need to shift your supply curve to the right. So what's happened because of that? Well, the price hasn't changed. Okay, we can still buy trousers at the world price, and therefore the quantity demanded hasn't changed. But what has changed is the number of goods that domestic producers can make and be competitive at the world price. So I probably should have written this in before, but that difference between QS and QD, that would have been the level of imports prior to the subsidy. We could call it M1, in fact. Now that we've got the domestic subsidy, which has reduced costs of production for our domestic producers, that's going to make some of them more competitive. And in fact, maybe think of it shifting downwards rather than shifting to the right. Instead of only QS number of domestic producers being competitive, we now have the intersection between the new supply curve and the world price line, QS1. Okay, so now this number of domestic producers are competitive, or rather the output that is being made by those domestic producers is now competitive. So essentially what we've done is we've increased sales, domestic sales, from 0 QS, that's where our domestic sales were before, to now having it all the way to there, domestic sales 1. So we've almost, according to my diagram, we've pretty much doubled the amount of domestic sales. What's happened to our imports? Our imports have fallen from QSQD to QS1QD. So in terms of a protectionist policy in which we were trying to reduce the number of imports, you can quite clearly see that the supply curve, that has been effective. We have effectively reduced the number of imports. Therefore, we are keeping jobs in the domestic production, and we're keeping domestic firms alive so that they're not essentially uncompetitive against foreign firms. What else can we do with this diagram? Well, we can do the same thing that we did with the tariff diagram and look for things like consumer and producer surplus. So these green bubbles indicate where consumer surplus was, the difference between the demand curve and the price. Now that we've had the subsidy, we're still demanding QD. And although the number of domestically produced output to foreign produced output has changed, i.e. there's more domestic than foreign, we're still consuming the same amount overall. QD remains QD. So, and world price remains world price. So therefore, consumer surplus hasn't changed, okay? Consumer surplus was this green shaded triangle before, and it still stays that, okay? So consumers are neither happier nor are they sadder. I suppose compared to tariffs, though, they are happier because in the tariff diagram, the price increased, consumer surplus went down. In this diagram, none of that happens. How about domestic producers? Well, domestic producers previously had a producer surplus of that small little triangle there. Now that more domestic producers are in or competitive, it's now increased to there. So they've kind of increased by that parallelogram there. So I should probably be writing this all up. Our consumers are kind of a bit meh. They haven't really changed. Our domestic producers are certainly happier. Okay. And also society, our social welfare has actually increased. There's no welfare loss like there was in the diagram. And if anything, it's actually increased, yeah? Community surplus or social surplus is just the addition of consumer surplus and producer surplus. Well, it was green plus orange, and now it's green plus orange, but the orange is bigger. Okay, so social welfare has increased as well. The government. Now, the government's an interesting one because in the tariff diagram, the government was collecting tax revenue. So we said that made the government happy because, you know, the government is getting a small little rectangle of government revenue. In this diagram, though, there's no government revenue. And in fact, what there is government spending. The subsidy has cost the government money. Now, I don't think this is necessarily in either of your specs, A-level or IB, but you can find out how much the government has spent on this subsidy. You just need to think about it in the same way that you would need to think about the tax revenue, but kind of apply it to a subsidy. So we are subsidizing only the domestic output, which is now QS1, and we've got to times it by the unit subsidy, which is the difference between those two curves there. So in fact, what we could do is we could read up to QS1, read up to there, and then we could do that, okay? And that would be the government spending. If you were ever to be asked about the firm's revenue for this, obviously you need to include the government spending as part of that revenue because the firm is seeing all of that, all of this rectangle now that's annotated by the red bubbles. Okay, that is all the firm's revenue or domestic firm's revenue. They don't just get the world price, they get the world price plus they get the government subsidy. Okay, so just make sure you're including that as well. Right, in terms of foreign producers, the government therefore is sad because they're spending money rather than collecting money. Foreign producers then, foreign producers are essentially unhappy. They were seeing that many sales, they were saying that amount of revenue, but now that their imports have been cut, they're only seeing that amount of sales and that amount of revenue. Okay, so foreign producers are unhappy as well. So a really good question might be asking you to compare tariffs to domestic subsidies, which is more effective given a particular circumstance or a particular context. Basically, what you need to do is just go through this. Okay, go through all the different stakeholders, see how they're affected. So for consumers, for example, consumers are much happier with a subsidy rather than a tariff. On the other hand, the government probably prefers a tariff rather than a subsidy. From a social welfare point of view, subsidies are much better than tariffs. But go through them, look at the contexts. It might be different in different circumstances. So, for example, a country that is suffering with a lot of inflation probably doesn't need a tariff as well. On the other hand, if it's a country which doesn't have much of an inflation problem and they don't have a huge budget deficit, then actually maybe this one is the solution. Okay, right. Anyway, I hope that all makes sense. Join me for the next one next time. Good to see you.